Some people have do research for academic purposes. I am an independent researcher. I do it kind of for my own. I just enjoy it. On Book of Mormon research. Some people said I'm kind of like a Star Trek researcher. I kind of go where no man has gone before. I take on topics that may be a little bit out there. So this book I wrote, it was a couple years ago that I wrote it. I kind of ran into the topic. I was doing the book on Ziff, which we were trying to figure out with some linguists what metal that would have been, and we also looked at the metallurgy of the plates based on the thickness and Emma's description of them, being able to thumb through them like parchment. And one of the issues was, okay, could you actually fit the entire Book of Mormon on this number of plates that we had calculated? And so I thought, well, let's look for character density. So I thought, well, let's look at the characters document, because that, in fact, is theoretically from the plates. And at that point, as I'm an engineer, and I kind of have always dabbled in ancient number systems. I just think they're kind of fascinating a little bit. And I noticed that one of the characters was a Mesoamerican 9, which was interesting. I was not the first to have noticed that. Dr. Sorensen also mentioned it in one of his books. And so I thought, well, let's maybe take a stab at seeing if there are some other numbers in there. Maybe we can get a date or something like that. So that was kind of what piqued my interest in starting to work on the characters document. This is the characters document. A lot of people call it the Anton transcript. Well, it is not the Anton transcript. The Anton transcript has a totally different description given to it. There's an emblem that's described on it. This came out of the David Whitmer family. It's owned by the Community Church of Christ, the RLDS, former RLDS church, and has actually been looked at recently by some church historian, people and experts in church history, and it looks to be, they did a handwriting analysis, it looks to be John Whitmer's handwriting, who was an early scribe in the church. Now, Joseph Smith indicated in the winter of 1827 that he had copied some characters off the plates and translated a few of them with the Urim and Thummim. As I mentioned, the handwriting analysis recently has shown that it is probably John Whitmer who actually penned it. And from the use of it, there's actually another part of the paper from a different picture that was recently discovered. It looks like they actually kind of use it as a missionary tool when they would go out and say, hey, we've got this Book of Mormon, here's some examples of the Reformed Egyptian. But anyway, it's fairly clear that it's not the Anton transcript that we're talking about here. This is a newspaper broadside from the Prophet, which was an LDS paper. As you can see, the characters here, they show them in the line, and those actually match pretty close to the characters document, except these right here, which I actually looked at and I said, well, why are those different? But I found that if you flipped and reversed them, they were identical. So that looks to be a printer issue when they transcribe them, which that's in the book. Nobody's really looked at that. And the other thing is I found is the characters document, if you look at it closely, the edge seems to be frayed a bit, and you can see that it's worn and looks like some of the characters have faded on the edge. Well, actually, there are some additional few characters here that show up. I thought, well, that would be useful, because what I don't want to do is start looking at an incomplete the document. You know, I want to make sure all the characters are looked at. And these are these additional, kind of showing off. Sorry, they're on the edge of the screen, but those are the additional characters that I was able to extract off the broadside. The characters document has probably been looked at by a lot of people, but there's not a lot published about it in terms of attempting to decipher it. Ariel Crowley did a series of articles in the improvement area back in 1942 and wrote a book in 1961, and he actually, and the reason I'm showing this is I decided I would use his designation of the characters, because that's the other thing you have to do. You actually say, okay, this is a character, here's a number, identify it. And interestingly enough, he was not really looking for a translation, because in that period of time, it's kind of Sidney Sperry theory that it was really, you couldn't really translate it because what you're looking at is essentially Hebrew writing that is using Egyptian phonetically, so you would really have no hope of deciphering it. But he was actually just trying to say, hey, I'm looking at these characters and I'm finding them in Egyptian or some form of Egyptian. And so he actually wrote a book where he identified some of these characters. Some he actually had meaning to them and actually was useful to me as I started looking at it. There's some other things that, you're looking at this document, you say, okay, is it upside down, is it right side, which way would the language flow? So there's some fundamental premises that kind of had to at least start off of to see if we could, ferret out something from this document. Because the intent originally was, hey, maybe I could just find a few things, let's see what we can find. So, and because the orientation of the title had characters, the assumption is, okay, he's copying it probably in the same orientation as it is on the plates. Joseph Smith indicated that the glyphs read from right to left. He said running the same as all Hebrew writing in general. And then looking at the script, the other thing is you say, okay, what kind of language are we really looking at? Is it an alphabetical language? Is it a syllabic language? Or is it logographic language, like Chinese? And one thing you look at is, okay, how many unique characters do you have? In English, for example, how many unique characters do you have when you write English? Well, 20, just the alphabet, 26, and then plus numerals. So that would be an alphabetical type approach. If it's syllabic, meaning that there is maybe a character for a syllable, you'd expect more unique characters. And finally, if it's fully logographic, which really not many languages would be classified that way, if any, then you're looking at maybe each separate word has its own unique character. So you get a lot of unique characters. So looking at, analyzing the document that way, it's pretty clear we're not looking at an alphabetical language, and really probably not a syllabic language. We're probably looking at a logographic language. Maybe there's some phonetic elements, I don't know, but at least it gives you some parameter to look at. Fourth, the Book of Mormon text indicates the characters are Reformed Egyptian, right? So it's logical to look for an Egyptian source with a likelihood that maybe there's some Mesoamerican and perhaps Hebrew influence. We have to remember that Reformed Egyptian is not capital R Reformed Egyptian. It's just a term that was used by Mormon to describe the language. So people say, oh, well, you can't find that Reformed Egyptian here. Well, it's not a formal language. It's just he's saying it has some elements in it that may be Egyptian. And so the other thing is I recognized what we're trying to do in initial translations. Often when I translate documents that are legal documents, I don't just try to do everything right at once. I just try to make sure I get the meaning, and then I work through it to make sure the syntax and grammar is correct. So in this situation, I thought, let's just see if we can get some meaning. Look at the individual characters and see if we can find some in Egyptian that give us some meaning. The primary resources I use for the Egyptian, that's the other thing, is there are three kinds of Egyptian, essentially, writing. I mean, there's variants, but basically you have the hieroglyphic Egyptian or monumental Egyptian, which is the hieroglyphs which you see on all the tombs and everything. And then you have hieratic, which existed basically concurrently with the monumental Egyptian, but is more of a shorthand or business administrative. I mean, the day-to-day documents would use that type of an Egyptian. It's more of a cursive kind of shorthand. And Demotic is a later version, kind of similar to hieratic, but its own version that came up later, which is also a cursive type script. But in looking at it, I said basically we do have Palestinian use of Egyptian that is found, and it's called Palestinian hieratic. So Dr. Vimmer has kind of collected, accumulated the different scripts or characters of that version of Egyptian. So I thought that's probably the best place to start to look, especially for the numbers. I also use Mueller's hieratic index, which is standard Egyptian index. Also the University of Chicago Demotic Dictionary and Domotische Glossar by Erickson. There's a lot of German Egyptologists, so you kind of have to know German to some extent to use these. And then there was another Spiegelberg that I also used. And again, this is what I'm trying to do is say, hey, I'm not going to divine anything. This is just going to be standard Egyptian text, and when I'm looking for a glyph or a character, I want to make sure that it is actually defendable academically. One thing that was interesting is in 1956, a member of the RLDS Church sent out some letters to different Egyptologists with the Characters document, and he had asked, who were the most prominent of the day, and got these responses. The first one is Alan Gardner, who's actually famous for writing Egyptian grammar. He said he didn't see any resemblance between the characters in any form of Egyptian writing. But William Hayes was an interesting one. He said, it could conceivably been an inaccurate copy of an Egyptian account or something of the sort written in hieratic script. With some imagination, the beginning of the inscription could be taken as a date, and many of the other groups look like hieratic numerals. Now, Eric Crowley said the same thing. He kind of said, I'm seeing numbers in here, so and so it couldn't be really Egyptian, because if that's the case, then this is more like an administrative tabulation or something like that. So he kind of had the same observation. And then finally, another Egyptologist says, well, maybe it's been altered so much that it's kind of taken it out of the realm where an Egyptologist could really render a proper decision or proper evaluation of this. And there have been other comments similar to Gardner, Egyptologists that just don't think it's really much Egyptian. So the general strategy that I was taking is, if I'm going to look through all these characters, I'm going to try to find those that have identified with a fairly straightforward identification with Palestinian hieratic, those that have maybe a straightforward identification from Mesoamerican sources, and then those from Egyptian hieratic or demotic. And then I'm going to the ones that maybe aren't quite in their form exactly right on, that maybe would be variants that are slightly different. Now, you have to understand, if you took everybody in this room and had them write their name in cursive, you're going to get quite a bit of variance in letters, okay? So the ancient script, it's not like they had to standardize everything's the same. So each scribal community, there was some variance. So when you look at these, you have to say, okay, there's a little bit of interpolation that's going to take place. Then I had some unknown numbers that maybe show up in a number sequence. So I know there's numbers on both sides, so I've got to be looking at a number probably. And throughout the process, I also there were some words that were pretty clear in the Egyptian hieratic that you could find the character for in the Characters document. So those were helpful sometimes in looking at the number, meaning you could see pure gold, for example, okay? Well, there's only, and I use the Book of Mormon, there's only 3 things in the Book of Mormon that are described as pure gold. There's a hilt of Laban's sword, gold that was used with King Noah's priests on the seats of the altar, and the 24 gold plates of the Jaredites. So, hey, there's a number, so maybe that's indicative of that I'm looking at a number sequence there. So the straightforward Mesoamerican numbers, the number 1 was a dot. That's not all that unique in terms of Mesoamerica. Dots can be used by various ancient systems for numbers. You had the number 9, which I pointed out. There's a number 2 that shows up, and what you have here is these C designations are, that's the number that was assigned from the Characters document by Crowley. Then this would be basically, I just directly cut and pasted right out of the dictionary. So I'm not interpolating anything, you can just see it. Then you have the number 3 here again. Number 4, number 5, number 6. Of course, some of them you could say, well, yeah, that's my kid scribbling, that's my older kid scribbling. But you have to say, okay, and I'm not saying it's 100% perfect, but that's part of what I'm trying to do is make some advance. This is more, I consider my research here more of like a farm's preliminary type research project, not, oh, I've just found everything, but it's to throw it out there and hopefully others maybe can look at it. The number 7, part of the problem too is some of the numbers, there really was not a lot of good representative numbers for that particular number in, let's say, Palestinian hieratic. So the number 10, barely, number 12, number 50, 1,000, 20,000, half, 1/3, ordinal number 1. I didn't really put all the Egyptian, that's just a well-known Egyptian with a line. Then I get to the variant Egyptian numbers, which one thing I was seeing was the numbers that I was identifying, there were these dots, okay, which were clearly had something to do with the number. And so I'm thinking, what are these dots actually representing? And as I kind of put together dates and number sequences, I kind of figured out what they were doing. And the single dot, typically, in this instance, it would be a 1, but it's actually serves as either a 1 or a 10, or it's a multiplies by 10, or multiplies by 100. Now, he's like, well, that's kind of a strange number system. I agree. But that's what seemed to make sense. And so you have the number 13 would be the number 3, which I showed you with a dot underneath it. 60 is a 6 with a dot up to the right. The 19, that's not the greatest match, but you did have a curve with a dot on the side, which would give you 19. Then the number, you have one of these, the various numbers that have these dots in it, and then one that doesn't. In the Egyptian, you have an 80, which has some similarity to it. And essentially, what I figured out is what you have is a number 40, which the tally marks are giving you marks of 10. And then the dots, again, consistent, are 10s. So you have a 40 here. And then as you have the 4 dots, that gives you the 80. Now, see, there's dots there on that archaic form. Anyway, I just found that the dots are actually consistently being used. Now, also here, you have a dot above. That's a 4. That actually equated to 400. Now, some of these you say, well, how did you figure this out? One thing I knew is you have numeric systems. The Mesoamerican system is a base 20 system, not a base 10. Base 10 is, to explain that, you have 10 times 100, or 10 times 10 equals 100, 10 times 100 is 1,000. So when you have 236, the 2 is representing hundreds, the 3 is representing tens, and the 6 is representing ones, right? Well, in a base 20, you have basically 20 instead of 10, and you have 400 instead of 100, and then you go to 8,000 instead of 1,000, so it's a different system. Then also you had a million, or also interpreted as multitude, and 1/7 or week. Now the book I wrote 2 years ago, I was doing a totally different avenue of research on Sumerian roots of some of the Jaredite names, and was looking at the proto-cuneiform, which is the pre-cuneiform, pre-2500 BC Sumerian, which they really haven't translated at all, except for the number systems, some of them. And it was interesting because there was a few of the numbers I knew what the value was, or that it was a number, and assigned a value to it, that actually I found in the Sumerian proto-cuneiform. The other thing is I noticed that the position of just like the dots have different position, give you a different value positionally, the same thing occurs in the proto-cuneiform. And this is one of the numbers that it's elevated. I had it at 30, and then if it's elevated, it's 300. The other thing that's interesting is you have, in the proto-cuneiform, you have dots that equal 10s and 1s, and curiously enough, some of the characters have similarities to the proto-cuneiform form. And as you notice, this is the date system. It's called the U system. One of the month glyphs actually looks pretty much like that. And then kind of interestingly enough, you also have the dots going inside of a character, adding value to it. So the number 20, as we get to, you'll see it has 2 dots in it, and also similar to shell glyphs in Mesoamerica. Also in the proto-cuneiform, you have bar and dot and tally number systems. You have that in Mesoamerica. I'm not saying that they, for sure, you can prove they came from there, but it's consistent with that. As I said, the number 20, if you look at it, what I just showed you, you have 2 dots within that glyph. That was clearly a number 20. You don't find that in Mesoamerica in quite that form. In the Olmec, there are some that look similar, but those aren't necessarily numbers. You also have number 9 rebus, and also in Mesoamerica, there's different ways of doing numbers. They just didn't have one system. Sometimes you had a glyph of an animal or something that showed you, yes, this is the number, or so they have actually quite a few glyphs for the same number. And then the bar dot, the interesting thing on the bar dot is the form that's in the characters document is not a typical Maya form. Maya is usually the dots are on top. And although they go sideways, and you can get some Maya forms that way, but this seems to be more consistent with the northern Teotihuacan or in the isthmus where the Teotihuacanos had come down and had influence. You see this form. Now, the number 400 was interesting because when I initially looked at it, I had the dot above, but I also said, you know, it also looks like some Aztec glyphs. And also it looks almost like pretty close to the Mesoamerican year sign. And I thought, well, this is interesting because I had assigned it a number 400. And then in doing the research, this is all not in the book, this is since then, is according to Edmondson, who was kind of the calendrical authority of most of the Mesoamerican calendars and published a large book on it, they indicated that the year almost certainly originated as a period of 400 days anciently, even though it's not really reflected. So I was saying, here, you got the Mexican year sign equaling 400. You have the Aztec glyph, which is a bundle of grass, equaling 400. And then in Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, Xihuitl, the word, means either solar year or grass. And then you also have the Aztec year sign associated with grass bundles, and classic Maya, some tufts of grass. Anyway, and then Brian Stubbs, whose research I had published, also showed that Xihuitl also looks to have a Semitic derivation of grass, etc. So it looks like I actually can say that character looks like you're finding it in Mesoamerica, and the number 400 is consistent with that. I'm not saying it is exactly, but now the number sequence, here's a number sequence that you had the 9 here, 20, 400. So you're looking at the base 20, and actually goes down 400, and then you have here, you have a 5 and a 10 and a dot. And the interesting thing about the 5 and the 10 is in the Maya, in the spoken Maya, sometimes they have a leading 10 or 15. It's kind of an anomaly. Because I thought this isn't making sense. I should have maybe a larger number going to smaller, but that actually is consistent with maybe a Mesoamerican practice. And this particular glyph set is followed by Egyptian glyph set that clearly looks to be ascending to the eternal land, okay? So I'm saying, okay, I look like I've got a death date of something. And then if you calculate that out, it's 479, which is actually matches the death date of King Benjamin. So anyway, so this was only the first part of the translation. It was an iterative process where I kind of went through looking at the numbers, looking at what I could find in the hieratic Egyptian. And then you have different things within the characters document. This is just showing you the numbers that are located. This is the interesting one. So you have that leading 15 and the number 9, and that also matches plates. So you have 15 plus 9 is what? 24. So those are interesting things. And there are also calendrical markers surrounding them, surrounding the number sequences that were interesting. And those look to be, and again, there's obviously going to be some debate on this, but it looks like the structure of the way that the dates were being put together was similar to the Mayan method of having a distance number, and then you have ADIs, anterior date indicators, and posterior date indicators. You set a date and you count backwards and forwards off of that date to get a particular date. Now, I'm not saying it was used exactly that way. And those ADI and PDI, some of the glyphs have been interpreted as the came to pass glyphs, and I saw some similarities between the glyphs. It's arguable, but I think what you're looking at is a Mesoamerican structure in the document. So anyway, I proceeded through a lot of effort, just once I had got some dates and some clear Egyptian, to actually go through hieratic, basically using those sources. And in the book, I document everything. So I show you the glyph that I'm looking at in hieratic. And I came up with a translation. Now, again, this is throwing it out there. I'm not saying it's 100% correct. But the first lines were clearly different than the others, and you can actually look at that from a structural standpoint. The translation of the first 4 lines looks to be basically it's a chronological summary from the 19th regnal year of Mosiah, and like the Egyptologist said, that first set of glyphs looked like some sort of date sequence. It did. It had a regnal year glyph in there, and then goes to the death date of King Benjamin. And again, I've rendered it in English, our current English, not Book of Mormon English. So it's not looking very scriptural, but that's kind of what I came up with. The second set of lines, let's see, in the document, which is, you'll notice that the lower 3 they're written differently, they're written smaller, and that's what I'm saying, it didn't seem to be contiguous. This I called kind of it looked like basically a summary of the prophetic, synopsis of the prophetic calendar in the Book of Mormon. So anyway, and again, the book, first of all, I don't sell the book really. It's free for a PDF on website, or I think it's even on in the Book of Mormon Central's archive. So anyone's free to look at it. I'm not in the business of selling books or selling anything really. I just like to get my research out there and have people bounce it off people. So, but that gives you a translation of the second 3 lines. I don't say that it's perfect, and there are some glyphs that you can look at and could be 2 or 3 different things, but it's pretty clear. It actually makes sense. It's chronologically consistent with the Book of Mormon. That's the interesting thing. When I laid it all out, it actually matches the chronology very well, which would tell you that's probably some proof that it, in fact, maybe has some correctness in the translation. And there was one interesting thing, as it was talked about the calendrical system, is in this set, the second set, the date that Christ came is given in the reign of the judges calendar system, which is interesting because that tells us that we're told, which this document also talks about, is that the calendar was changed 9 years after Christ came. They talk about that in the Book of Mormon. But what looks to be happening is it looks like there is this second calendar that wasn't changed, that they're still tracking. And it only makes sense as I thought about it, because some of the prophecies that were given, and that's been one issue in the Book of Mormon that probably has not made too much sense. There is some explanation for the 600-year prophecy, a way to get that to match. But if you leave in 587 BC, Christ is born in 5 BC, those things don't really give you 600 years. Samuel the Lamanite made 2 prophecies. He made one that was a 5-year prophecy, but he made one that was a 400-year prophecy, where the sword of justice would fall on the Nephites in 400 years, and that was 5 years before Christ. Well, that doesn't work, because you have 384 AD is when the battle took place. Then Alma had a prophecy that said 400 years after Christ came in the flesh would be the extinction of the Nephites. That also doesn't work, because you had Moroni, the last one, burying the plates in 420, or just right after 420. But the calendar that's indicated there looks to be the uncorrected lunar calendar, which is a 354.37 day calendar. And if you throw that number in for the years in the Book of Mormon, those prophecies match exactly. And what you had happening was Samuel the Lamanite, when he made his prophecy, it was not under the new calendar that was instituted 9 years after Christ. He was making it under the calendar that he was operating under. So was Alma. So it actually makes sense. So that was one thing that kind of came out of this character's document. Again, the attempt is not proving Book of Mormon true. I've never cared about that in my research. I'm not an apologist. I just like to find out things about the Book of Mormon that I never knew, and share my research. If people like it, they like it. If not, it's okay. Some of the anti-Mormons have got really angry. So this document is making me mad. I said, I can tell you what you need to do. Delete it. I don't want you being angry. That was not the intent of my research. Just delete it. It's free too, so you can't even argue that you didn't get what you paid for. And so, again, the attempt here is just to put it out there. I've already moved on to other research. I think this is still worthy of some research I'm working on. And like I said, I've got a couple other books. Ziph, you might find that interesting. if you're into chemistry and other boring stuff like that. The geology of the Book of Mormon was one I actually gave a presentation on last time. You may not recognize me because I sported a beard at that time. Kirk told me, unless I was speaking on geology, that was kind of a beard card I was given for that conference. And the other thing is, Kirk actually did a paper on beards in Mesoamerica, so I know there were Nephite geologists for sure. And this is a book that I'm coming out with in a couple months. It's Sumerian Roots of Jaredite Names in the Book of Mormon. What it's looking to is actually finding etymological sources of the names. Most of the names look to be metonymic, meaning they actually have mean something associated to the individual, like Akish, for example. A in Sumerian is power, Kish is secret netherworld. Similar to, that Akish was the one that helped institute the secret society. So this book should be interesting, hopefully in a dry sort of way, but it's like 700 pages, so I tried to get people to review it, and they're like, you can pay me $2,000 to read 700 pages of Sumerian etymology. So that's one reason. I do try to get peer review, et cetera, as an independent researcher, but some of it I just kind of put it out there, and the peer review comes by, especially with the internet, everybody responds, people can engage, and anyway. So hopefully, one thing I would say is one source I did not use for the translation was the Michigan relics, if that makes you feel